So welcome back for this second panel. It is in my quality as Wallenberg Academy Fellow that I have the honor and the pleasure to announce this panel on the dark side of democratization. The idea behind the panel isn't, however, as gloomy as it might first seem. Darkness is, after all, and I'm saying this, of course, that's in quality of a philosopher, right? Darkness is, after all, for us, a way to see things. So, consider the shadows of your hands, the shadows cast by your hands. We know this, shadows do not reflect light, so you don't see them because they reflect light. And you don't see them because they absorb light either. I mean, you'd see the black text behind me because they absorb light. The more they absorb it, the more you'd see it. But that is not the case of shadows. So shadows, we know, as Isaac Newton taught us, are absences of light. So when I see the shadow in front of the page, what I'm actually seeing is absence of light. So allow me this analogy. The dark side of democratization lets us see things in a sharper way, in a more proportionate light. And this way of viewing democracy that takes shadows into consideration, that takes the absences into account, I think typically takes the form of diagnosis. So diagnosis of democracy's condition is, of course, necessary if we are to understand what is going on. And there's a paradox, we know this, in the way we live democracy. Not merely and not solely because there's a gap between what democratic theory had promised us and the lives we actually live. Now, I don't want to say anything about your life, of course, but I find my life, at least, pretty far off the mark of the kind of self-satisfied, fully autonomous beings that classical democratic theory had in mind. And this is even considering that I have a pretty good life by all reasonable standards. So, I mean, we know this. There are a certain number of unkept promises of democracy. It was supposed to empower the individuals, and we see groups empowered. The representatives were to freely deliberate, and we require mandates. Oligarchies persist, secrecy persists. Democracy is allowed a limited space. The citizenry was supposed to be educated through participation. Another unkept promise of the classical theory that the political philosophers developed about democracy. Now, some think that these unkept promises of democracy warrants us to call regimes that we see elective autocracies or illiberal democracies. I mean, the labels here abound. But so there's a gap between the normative ideal and real democracies or real-world politics regimes. But there's more to this paradoxical side of things. So never before have we lived in an age where democracy set the canon of good governance in such a publicly acknowledged way. Never before have we stood before challenges like the ones we face today. So global challenges, human challenges, challenges that call for collective decision-making. Now, finding solutions to collective dilemmas is something that democracy is good at, we suspect at least. So this is so, however, only under certain conditions, only assuming certain things. And these assumptions are themselves being challenged. So one such challenge that I myself work with a bit is migration. More specifically, what I'm interested in is discretion and arbitrariness in contemporary policies involving migrants in the EU. Now, discretionary practices then come in many shapes. So the shadows can have many shapes. From indefinite detention, say, that is without trial, to simply omitting to give motivations in legal decision-making. Now, we heard in the first panel, right, that judicial accountability might be of importance to democracy. And the reason why I'm interested in these shadows is that, in law at least, this is precisely arbitrariness and discretion is precisely the stuff of which shadows are made. So as a philosopher of law, unsurprisingly, I'm interested. The project that I'm running for the Wallenberg Foundation looks at some of these practices. And what they share is that they challenge the rule of law in various ways. So they make the route to citizenship longer and less foreseeable. The name, however, of the project is much easier to foretell. It's called civis sum, as the Romans used to say before the courts. I am a citizen. So the route to citizenship matters for democracy in various ways. Rules on citizenship have a constitutional nature. They matter for defining the constitutional identity of a polity. So it's not an issue that just ought to be left to the public administration. Scholars need to work harder on this. Citizenship is the bedrock of democracy. It concerns, of course, the right to vote, but also participation in democratic life beyond elections. And here's an asymmetry. So on the one hand, we have non-citizens who participate in society in various ways. And this form of politics most often do not even come up on the radar of democratic systems. And on the other hand, there are citizens who do not partake in the social fabric of the polity. So there's a mismatch between those who are subject to collective decisions and those making these decisions. Now, I find it fascinating to investigate why we exclude people from citizenship. So what makes a person unfit for a democracy? I believe this is interesting because it's telling of who we are and how we live. So, in a certain sense, it's simply untrue to claim that democracy connects the population to the power holders because the population is a set different from the people or those having nationality. So today we see modern metics, non-nationals who live permanently under a determinate rule of law to which they do not participate in any way to the formation of collective decision-making there. Modern metics and sometimes slaves. But that's only one shadow, right? So that's one aspect of the dark side. But I think there's many ways in which the absence of democracy, just like the absence of light, is something that we need to look into if we want to understand democratization. So among those who see the dark matter of the democratic universe are those that you will now hear. So let me call to the podium first Teorell, then Joakim Sandberg, and then Elin Bjarnegård. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Thanks for inviting me here. I can say right away that when I was told I was going to be on the panel, The Dark Side of Democratization, I became a little bit uncomfortable because I'm typically a person who is pretty optimistic about democracy and democracy's future. But I'll try to do my best, rise to the challenge, and be as gloomy as I can. And I also want to say that I think it is important to try to be gloomy at times, because I think one could sort of face certain challenges better in that way. Be prepared, if you like. So I want to be an optimist, but I want to be prepared. And I'm going to talk about democracy's critics. Who is the enemy? And not necessarily in terms of certain forces or people or countries, but at the level of ideas. When I was an undergraduate student in political science, here in Uppsala, actually in the early 90s, we had to read Robert Dahl's Democracy and Its Critics. And we then learned that there are two kinds of criticism against democracy. One is anarchism, and the other is what Dahl called guardianship, what we might call technocracy. I think if Dahl had written this book today, he would have added a third kind of criticism, and that is populism. So let me start talking a bit about populism, what I mean by that, and in what way that is a criticism against democracy. So populism, broadly defined, the way I see it, is an idea that political decision-making should be guided by sort of the unmediated, unconstrained will of the people. That is an idea that is anti-pluralist. It has an anti-pluralist view of society. So there is this one true source of guidance for politics. And you can find that by asking the people. Think Erdogan, when he, addressing his opponents, said that we are the people, who are you? Secondly, populism is anti-democratic by being very skeptical about the kind of representative system driven by political parties and multi-party competition that we take for given in democratic countries in the world today. So populism is not against all features of democracy. Populists don't necessarily defy universal citizenship or voting rights. They don't necessarily complain about elections as such, particularly not if they can win those elections. But there are again certain democratic institutions, the ones that can fetter or constrain this will of the people. Judicial independence, checks on the executive, minority rights, and a critical media, to mention a few very important ones. And it's thus not very surprising that in countries such as Putin's Russia, Orban's Hungary, Erdogan's Turkey, or maybe now even in Poland, these are exactly the kind of institutions that are under attack by the populist kind of critique against democracy. What's driving this? What drives the rise of populism? I think we can say right away that we don't really know. And this could be one thing that the Wallenberg Foundation could throw a big bag of money on, trying to figure out. But I'll actually wager that one important explanation, one important driver of this, is what the Swedish Prime Minister, once Prime Minister, called the I'll look up my good English translation, the discontent of rising expectations. De stigande förväntningarnas missnöje in plain Swedish. The discontent of rising expectations. We simply expect too much from democracy. We expect it to solve all our problems. We expect it to deliver material wealth. We even expect it to make us happy. And I don't think democracy should be justified in terms of what it can deliver, either materially or immaterially. I think we should be democrats because democracy is a good in itself. We already heard a short, brief discussion about intrinsic versus extrinsic values of democracy, and I think we need to put premium on the intrinsic values of democracy. It's simply better to live in a country where you don't get imprisoned or tortured for your public opinion, or for your political opinions. It's better to live in a system where you can vote for different leaders or parties, not only for one, or not at all. That's what good democracy is good for, not necessarily what it brings you. And I think those expectations are part of the expectation. Two big expectations are part of the explanation for populism's rise. So populism is on the rise. Democracy, in the sense that populism criticizes, is thus in decline. But that's also important when you talk about the dark side of democratization. That doesn't mean that there is a general decline of democracy in the world. We already heard this in Staffan's presentation in the morning. It's not necessarily the case that democracy is declining, but it has stopped progressing. We become used to the fact that democracy is making progress. It has since at least the 70s. It's not anymore. But we're tricked into thinking that it's in decline because of those countries that I, for example, just told you about. They are more in our geographical proximity. So the fact that democracy in decline in countries closer at home, or in countries that are culturally, at least, perceived to be closer to us, makes us think that democracy is in decline. But then we forget about other places where it's actually not in decline. Think Tunisia. We heard other examples: Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan. Even despite the atrocities that's going on there in Burma or Myanmar. So I don't think democracy is in decline in the world, but I think it's in decline in our heads. And speaking of our heads, let me end by talking a bit about that other critic of democracy, which is not populism, but guardianship or technocracy. As pointed out by Daniele Caramani in an article published in the APSR, American Political Science Review, this year, populists and adherents of technocracy actually have several things in common in their criticism against democracy. They are both anti-representation, anti-political parties. They don't believe in the kind of representative system driven by political parties that we have. Think China. They are also anti-pluralists. So they believe that there is this one true solution or some kind of objective solution to problems that we somehow can discover out there in the world. But the main difference, of course, is that adherents of technocracy, they don't think it's the will of the people who hold the answer to what this true solution is, but technocrats or experts, scientific experts, that they can somehow discover the solutions to our problems. They can both identify the problems and then can discover the solutions to them. It's a kind of criticism you actually encounter sometimes among environmental activists wanting to combat climate change. Since ordinary people apparently don't really understand the threats posed to the Earth, their voice should be disregarded. We should ignore the ordinary people's voice and instead give power to the expert who know the problem and also can design the solutions. So it is as anti-democratic as populism, I would say, and it's as dangerous. Maybe in one sense even more dangerous, because technocracy, or the idea of guardianship, is actually an idea that has much easier to take root even among intellectuals and academics, since it's based on the idea that the scientific method somehow can solve political problems for us, both identify them and solve them. So I'll end by saying that I venture that is the kind of anti-democratic criticism that is most present in this room.
Thank you. Let me give the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm Joakim Sandberg. I'm a Wallenberg Academy Fellow from Gothenburg in philosophy. I want to start by thanking the Wallenberg Foundation for letting me come speak. I'll digress a bit from the issue of political democracy, because my research is on what really rules the world, namely money, right? So my interest is in sort of the democratization of the economy, or of more specifically of finance. My project is called The Philosophy of Responsible Finance, and it seeks to develop an understanding of how to integrate social and environmental concerns into the purposes and practices of financial institutions and markets. Let's, for once, see, for now, see this as a kind of application of issues in how to get democracy to work in a specific field. The background is that there is a growing concern that the money system or finance is not working in the interests of the people. Would you agree? Especially since the financial crisis, this has been a growing sentiment. The question is then how to bring the purposes and practices of finance back in the interests of people. So one idea could be a sort of democratization, somehow giving more power to ordinary people to determine financial practices. Another could be what the previous speaker talked about, a kind of technocracy or a meritocracy, or maybe we should say a paternalism. That is, matters being decided over your head, but for your sake. So these are sort of perspectives that I analyze. I want to give two examples of how these can come into conflict, and sort of discussion points for determining which of the two is most plausible. So one is about pension fund democracy. Oh, what a boring topic you see. No. So You're all now pension investors, although you don't want to think about that at this early age that we're all in. You all have pension money accruing somewhere, but go figure, there's a great difference between what you all, when we ask sort of the general population, think that your pension managers should be thinking about and what they're actually thinking about, yeah? They come from the business school, they come from mainstream financial theory, and they think the role of financial agents is to maximize sort of risk-adjusted returns, as they said. Whereas if we ask people in general, do you think that they should also care about, well, you know, people and the planet, we get an overwhelmingly positive response. There are obviously overlaps between those two. I'm not going to go into those specifics here now. How should we go about making pension fund managers care more about the interests of the general public, which are their beneficiaries? So one idea could be to democratize pension funds. How would that work in practice? I don't know. We could have votes on what your pension funds should do, or we could have smaller groups to decide what pension funds should do. There are attempts to do that. Here's a big problem. Let me remind you, I'm on the dark side panel here, so excuse me now. Here are big problems with that. People don't care about their pensions, right? People don't want to be bothered. People don't even open their orange envelope, as you don't want to know about, Swedish pension envelope. Why? We think financial assets in the first place are too abstract. We think finance is too complicated, and about pensions, that's just too far off in the future, we think. So we have a big sort of attitude versus action gap in pension ethics. People think that we should invest sustainably, but they don't necessarily choose the sustainable investment alternatives. So there seems to be a problem of democracy, in a sense, in this here. What is the alternative? Well, I guess the alternative is for a state mandate for pension funds to consider ethics and the environment. If you didn't know, that's what we have in Sweden. So the general pension funds, AP-fonderna, they have a state mandate which says you should consider ethics in the environment without letting this interfere with good returns. That's a big proviso, obviously. So that's just what I wanted to say. What works here? It seems to me and many others in this field that democracy in this particular field does not work very well, and seemingly a kind of paternalism works better. So that's interesting. The other example I want to use is consumer democracy. So you're all probably familiar with consumers' possibility to take ethical stand on global issues. Yeah. So I'm interested in this sort of juxtaposition of the individual, small individual, and global ethical problems, like global justice, whether you should choose fair trade goods or not. Yeah. The mass misuse of animals, whether you should choose vegetarian or not, and the destruction of our planet, whether you should choose ecological goods or not. So these global problems come into our everyday lives through the market. Now, one might view that as a kind of democratic situation. We can now all sort of choose whether we should address these issues or not. We can buy the fair trade goods or not. We can choose whether we want to save the planet or not. It's all up to us, a kind of economic democracy. So once again, I pose a critical question, is that a good solution? Once again, I think there are problems of using democracy in that way. And once again, because too many people choose that option. Yeah, markets convey different kinds of motives. One is our values, But another is just, well, we want the cheapest things. And another is our identity and our tradition and all those things. So markets also often lock us into complicated social dilemmas. If I want to change something, I stop buying animal products, someone else buys them, or they're put on sale so that someone else buys them. So the market sort of blocks my high ambitions, if you will. So the market sometimes works against democracy there. Once again, what's the alternative? Well, I guess some kind of state-run mandate to care about these issues. Well, global justice reforms and animal ethics reform, etc. An interesting thing that I want to end with there is, in my book that I wrote on this recently, I sort of ended with saying, well, you know, I'm not sure whether a political democracy really can solve these issues either, because think about it, global justice is about justice between Swedes and people of third world countries, but the only ones that can vote in our elections are the Swedes. So are we going to solve that? Think about climate change. That's about us and future generations, but future generations can't vote, that's only us. And think about animals, obviously. We don't let animals vote, and I don't promote that either. So they can't vote, but we vote. So we have a system where sort of there's a conflict between two parties, but only the one party can vote. So democracy doesn't seem to work there. Conclusions. Whether democracy in this applied context is a good thing depends on who gets to vote and obviously whether they actually vote and use that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Elin Bjarnegård from the Department of Government here at Uppsala University. I would like to talk about caution when it comes to democratization. The need to be a bit cautious and to, you know, think about whether the positive developments that we think we see may not be as good as they seem. Maybe they are even, you know, rarely as good as they seem. To make sure that there is, you know, that we don't run the risk of being complacent and saying, okay, we have democratized, things should be going well now, to instead really keep a sound level of skepticism, and that regards research as well as practitioners, and just really analyzing what we see. And I kind of build this argument of sound skepticism based on the research that I do, not least of gender and politics in this field. And the realization also that anti-democratic actors are very creative and very innovative and almost always a step ahead of the rest of us when it comes to thinking about how electoral laws can be fiddled with and can be changed and reformed to suit the dominant parties. When it comes to thinking about how reforms that may seem to be about increasing equality are actually mainly there in order to increase the legitimacy in the eyes of the international community. And we as researchers, we need to try to keep up with these anti-democratic actors, to kind of try to see what it is they're doing, to look behind the scenes, to actually look at the dark sides of democratization in order to understand what's going on. And I'm going to give you two examples of how I think, you know, a seeming progress for women's participation in democracy can in fact be pitfalls, at least partly be pitfalls. And those two examples will be the rise of gender quotas, how they are put in place, which is seemingly good from many ways, from many ways of looking at it, but they're not necessarily there to really boost the participation of women, but sometimes to boost the power of the ruling party. I'm also going to return to the topic of social media that was addressed in the first panel here, to say again how this great promise of all these new avenues of participation and the spread of mobilization and of information is also a particular threat to certain groups. And here as well, there's a special gendered effect of how social media has an impact on democratic actors today. So to start with quotas. As we all know, that's one of the kind of unfulfilled promises of democracy. We thought that it would mean equal participation for everyone, at least from a kind of philosophical point of view. But we know, they're far from sufficient, the democratic institutions, when it comes to actually guaranteeing equal participation of all groups. 20 years ago, 88% of all parliamentarians in the world were men. So today, 2 decades later, we stand at 75% of all parliamentarians of the world are men. And that's, of course, both progress, but it's also kind of still disappointing in a sense that 50%, if we look at the group of women in the world, are represented by 25% in parliaments all over the world. It does mean, on the other hand, that in the 2 past decades, we see over 5,000 more women who are active as politicians. And a lot of these women that increase in these 20 years are because the explosion of gender quotas around the world. The adoption of electoral gender quotas is one of the largest electoral reforms of our time. There are a number of different gender quotas, but all in all, over 100 countries now use electoral quotas in some form. What we need to look at when it comes to gender quotas is, of course, they increase the participation, but there are, as I said, a number of different ways in which they can be designed, and there are a number of different regimes in which they can be implemented. Some of the quotas are implemented in very authoritarian socialist regimes where we know the parliaments are not really powerful actors at all. Many of them, and actually our recent research shows that most of them are implemented in semi-democratic, electoral authoritarian regimes. And in these countries, when we take a closer look at them, we have to make sure that we analyze who these quotas benefit, apart from the women that they bring in, but how are they designed? And to what extent are they designed so as to benefit the ruling party, the dominant party? In these countries, we know that they may have all the formal democratic institutions in place, but as I said, these actors are phenomenal when it comes to understanding how to make electoral reforms work in the favor of the dominant party. It has everything to do with everything from, constituency boundaries to electoral systems to managing the actual elections. And I think that gender quotas haven't really been scrutinized from this perspective. They've been scrutinized a lot in the field of gender and politics, but they haven't really moved on to the study of the menu of manipulation, where we have all these items that rulers use to kind of manipulate seemingly democratic institutions. But I think they should be on there. What we see is that they are often put in place, first of all, to boost international legitimacy. It seems nice to bring in new actors, to bring in women, but they're also very often designed to make sure that those women that come in will primarily represent the ruling party. So they're put in place seemingly to level the playing field between men and women, but instead they may often contribute to skewing the playing field between political parties even more. To move on to the second area of caution that's seemingly great, but that also has a dark side. I want to say something about social media and its role in elections. I think there are probably not many people in this room that are, just optimists when it comes to social media. I think we recently seen a lot of its dark sides. It's very difficult not to see them when we have, foreign policy being tweeted, for instance. I mean, it is certainly a new thing that's not just bright. But it was one of those things, and it still is to a large extent, where we see that it opens up for participation by new groups. It has been talked about also in gender studies as something that will include women, because it lowers a lot of those barriers for participation that has to do with going into the public space. You can politically participate from your home, you can be informed, you can take part of transitional movements, and you can mobilize online. But what research shows is that the same resources that we need to mobilize offline are important for mobilization online. So we see the cementing of the same structures also online. We see that the political polarization is magnified by social media, and the spread of messages, information also means a spread of intimidation, of threats, and of more dangerous messages. The question that needs to be asked is, to what extent is social media just a new vehicle for information? Or is it actually something that's new in its form, something new, a new type of challenge to democracy? We've always seen pamphlets with misinformation, we've seen rumor spreadings, we've seen, all of these are methods that we know from way back that have been part of politics and democracy. But I do think that the rapid spread of social media and the rapid spread with which news now travel across the world, and the diffusion that is completely unprecedented of these messages has to challenge the way that we think about how democracy is run. And this also has gender aspects. In research on election violence that I do, for instance, this is something that we don't really have in the methods for data collection so far. In election violence, we still tend to focus on hotspots. Where is physical violence taking place? Geographical location of violence, where does it happen? In public, what's visible? What can election observers report on? When I do interviews and surveys in places like the Myanmar and the Maldives, I see that this is not the most dangerous place for women. And this is what we know from research on violence against women everywhere. It doesn't take place in public. It doesn't take place, by unknown perpetrators. And this is what we see in election violence today as well. Whereas men are still most likely to be the victims of physical violence taking place in the public, women are much, much more likely to be the victims of psychological violence, of threats, of intimidation, of rumor spreading online. And of course, from a cost-benefit analysis, from the point of view of the perpetrator, in many societies it might even, not be a good idea to physically attack a woman. That wouldn't seem very, that would even backfire on the perpetrator. And especially if you can, spread a rumor, often with sexual connotations, or spread a photo of a political candidate in a bikini, which actually destroyed, a photoshopped photo, destroyed a female candidate's campaign in the Maldives by having this photo spread. That's a much easier and less risky way of destroying a political opponent's campaign than it is to actually send someone after to physically assault that person. So to conclude, I think we need to ask ourselves, are we up to speed? Are we as good at seeing these new technologies, the new social media, and how they can be used? Can we capture with our methods the intimidation and the harassment that's going on online with the methods we use? And also, can we think of the institutional innovations in the same way and as rapidly and as innovatively as those seeking to actually destroy democratic institutions are able to?
So, despite my intention not to be so gloomy, it turned out to have some really dark spots into this scenario. So let me investigate those a little bit more, right? Now, it seems to be the case that there are several problems with democracy, or the form of democracy as we know it. Some of these problems seem to be intra-systemic, some of them seem to be extra-systemic. But there seems also to be some kind of dividing line here between those who seem to think that democratic regimes are somehow unfit to respond to certain kinds of social challenges, and those who seem to think that we do not hold evidence to make that claim. So I would like to start by asking you, how do you relate to this distinction, and where does that dividing line pass in your research field?
Should I start? I think we know pretty much about when democracy works and when it doesn't, or what it works for and what it doesn't work for. I think, for example, in the last panel, Karl-Henrik Knudsen gave an excellent overview of the kinds of outcomes, research has looked at for decades, where we are pretty certain that there are positive outcomes of democracy, and others where we really don't know. I think sort of the main dividing line is, I would say, between those who think democracy has a good outcome or good is good overall, and those who think that it's not fit for solving the main problems, and therefore, so it's not really about knowledge versus no knowledge. It's different kinds of knowledge or different kinds of beliefs about what democracy is good for, I would say.
Okay. Different kinds of belief that we would like to be based on knowledge as far as possible, right? So do you find this dividing line in the research areas that you're involved with?
Do you want?
No, yeah.
Well, I think not really. I think in the research that I'm involved with, it's about pushing that research agenda, as I said, to kind of constantly tackle the challenges of democracy. And democracy, as we know it and as it works now, may not be enough to tackle all those challenges. But it's rather about, I don't think I see a lot of challenge of the principle of democracy. But when it comes to the institutions, and I would include both the formal institutions of democracy, how they work, and also the more informal institutions at the backside, and everything that needs to be in place for those institutions to work well. There, I think I see a lot of criticism that they're not sufficient and they need to be reformed, and we need to work with them, but not with regards to the principle of democracy.
Okay, so you don't think it's not a normative issue, but it's more an issue about how to?
In the research field that I do, yeah.
Don't you think that the first can be sort of hid below the other? So, yeah. So I think researchers explore different problems or challenges with democracy, or weaknesses and ways of, for instance, educating the people or making them make the right choice, for God's sake, make the right choice. But they don't necessarily sort of call it something other than democracy. We don't want to challenge that paradigm, but there's certainly so much research going on sort of how to make it work.
Let me get back to that relationship between science and politics, because there seems to be that came out in your discussion. It came out in the issue about whether we can actually expect a regime to live up to come to the best outcomes or not. And this has to do with the relationship between, I guess, science, knowledge, and politics, which is an eternal rub, right? It came back also in the issue about guardianship. And here my question is, how do you see social science and humanities, which is a particular form of knowledge? So how do you see social science and humanities being a way to go forward, for instance, in tackling the problem of the decline in our head, as you were referring to?
I just think we need to make some distinctions when we talk about negative sides or dark sides of democratization, because I think we're talking about at least three different things. One is, is is democracy sometimes bad? I mean, does it actually produce things we don't want? And there aren't, numerous such things in the literature, but of course there are examples. We know, for example, that having some democracy that's opening up a system and having electoral competition actually makes corruption increase, for example. So we know that autocracies are better than at least semi-democracies at fighting corruption. And I mean, there are other examples of that. That's one thing. Another is sort of, and this I think is what you talked about when you talked about female participation. There are sort of remaining challenges. What happens after the revolution? You don't get everything at once. We get some democracy, but there are a lot of things to do still. And there are, of course, I mean, in our countries as well. And the third thing is threats. I mean, what forces, either in terms of structures, markets, or actual actors are combating, if you like, democracy. I think most social scientists are both Democrats in their heads and want to produce new knowledge to fight all those things. So I'm very optimistic when it comes to this, the role of the social sciences when it comes to this. I wouldn't speak for the other sciences, however.
In my field, there's, I think, lots of interesting research going on sort of, well, behavioral economics, or sort of how to influence what's often called the choice architecture. So sort of what choices people face, so to make them make the right choice. So it's once again sort of, I think, a kind of hidden, really, compromise between democracy in that very loose sense and some kind of meritocratic ideal of there actually being a right choice. So we design the architecture so that people more easily make the right choice. So that could, for example, be an explanation of what I said about the Swedish pension plans, that sort of if you don't choose, you get the public pension fund, and that already has a mandate to care about nature. But then you can choose something else. So when that's sort of the predetermined choice, most people don't make a choice, and so they end up there. So that's a way of using sort of
nudging.
Yeah, nudging. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I would agree with Jan that there are challenges that we haven't met yet, and I think that social science would like to meet them, but I think we need to learn how to think out of the box and not just build on previous knowledge. Of course, we should do that, but also learn to be more creative and to think, well, what would the next step be here? Of course, there is an ethical potential danger of doing so. I'm part of a project where we're writing about pre-electoral malpractice in Southeast Asia, and we look at this table of contents and we realize we're writing a handbook for how to do this. So I mean that's always the kind of challenge there. But we do need to think outside of the box and to also allow for that much more. I think I would add another thing, and where I think the incentives for collaborations between practitioners in the field and academics need to be much better. I think there's a lot of things happening on the ground, and I think many organizations see things before we do, and it's sometimes quite hard to get that collaboration to work because of different timelines and just different incentives. And I think that is something that would make us better equipped to actually deal with some of those challenges.
Okay, so a lot to do, and particular underexplored forms of doing it, I understand. So if I were to ask you the question, what is in your view perhaps the one or two areas that in relationship to your field of expertise are the most underexplored, and the direction perhaps in which science ought to move in the next decade? What would you pinpoint?
Well, to reiterate, and that's not perhaps an area, but that's again the collaboration between practitioners and academics. I think that is important and will give us new content to focus on as well. As I indicated in my presentation, I think that social media in its various forms will have to be something that we learn to understand how it works much more. And I see that coming a lot, but I also see us lagging behind, and I think we need to work. That's one area where interdisciplinarity can really work. I also see in my field that there's a lot of knowledge on the gender aspects of democracy, but it's still within one field, and whereas the democratization field has a lot of knowledge, and when you put the two together, there is a lot to learn from there, and I see that there's not a lot of exchange between those two fields. There could be much more, and I think it would be fruitful.
So cross-fertilization. Okay, I'll take that one home. There's something you would like to add about the areas that you think?
Yeah, I mean, I pointed at one already in my talk. We know far much more about the drivers of transitions to democracy or democratization than we know about the reverse direction of change. We know far less about the drivers of autocratization, if you like. I mean, if I would caricature the literature, I think the only thing we will know by certainty is that rich countries are much less likely to autocratize than poorer countries, and that does, of course, not take us very far. I would point out that as one area. Another has to do with something that sort of has been looming here in the room and also in your speech, and that is the disfit between the kind of community that democracies are designed to rule over, which is, I don't like to call the nation state, but I don't think there are. I mean, Iceland is a nation state. I think that's the only nation state in the world, actually. So where the borders of the nation and the states coincide. But let's call them territorial states. We think that territorial states is where democracies should, what they should rule over. But we also know that so many things cross these borders all the time. So many problems are trans-border problems. And we think that this is more so now than it was before. I think it was like that all the time, actually. I think just that the genesis of democracy occurred at the time when we thought that we could sort of solve these things within our territorial borders. So how can democracy be developed to also to take into account other kinds of communities than the ones that we've been sort of traditionally been thinking about? Problems crossing those communities.
And that takes up the issue about whether democracy is only able to promote the preferences of the voters, of course, and that who determines who are to be the voters, right? But I found that very interesting. So it's a way of saying, I guess, that the dark side is in itself a underexplored field. Yeah, right? It is. What would you see as future lines of research connecting to your field of research?
Well, it's, as someone mentioned previously, sort of the interplay between capitalism or the economic system and the democracy. Obviously, the economic system can both hinder and sort of facilitate democracy, and there's already research on that. There's very little research on the sort of the money side, the money itself side, the finance side. So how can money sort of either help democracy or hinder it?
Thank you. Maybe we should open up for questions.
I think there is an elephant in the room, and his name is Donald Trump. And this is a question also, I mean, as my colleagues in the Varieties of Democracy project knows, I think it's a fantastic goldmine and a major achievement in the social sciences that we will use for many, many years. But, and Staffan alluded to this a little, but there is, of course, also a qualitative dimension to democracy. I mean, there are two problems here. One is, and I'm a sinner here as well with the data I have been using, we are counting countries. But that means that a country like Cape Verde, a democracy, with 480,000 people, get the same statistical weight as China. Now, if you think about democracy in the world, I think it's also reasonable to ask how many people are actually living under a democracy. I mean, we are speaking, if it is good for human well-being, we have to count the people, not the countries. So I think this unit problem is a little problematic. Then I think there is a qualitative dimension here. I mean, if Senegal would de-democratize, we wouldn't be so surprised. But what is happening in the United States is, I think, quite worrying. Both Jan and I were at the American Political Science Association meeting a couple of weeks ago with our 6,000 colleagues, and I went to a number of panels about the Trump election, of course. And one thing that came out very clearly is that America has not only elected a president who openly ridicules handicapped people, who brags about sexually assaulting women, who says that you could completely disregard science when you use politics. It seems to be clear, and here I disagree with John, that this populism is not driven so much by economic consideration, but by racial resentment. And this sends a very, very dangerous message to politicians in the United States and around the world that mobilizing on racial resentment and xenophobia pays off. Now, why am I worried? Well, I rely on two quite well-known and established colleagues at Harvard, Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, who 1 week before the election of Trump wrote a piece saying, well, he will lose, of course, but still the Democratic Party has an important lesson to learn. And they were referring to a famous legend in political science, Juan Linz, no longer with us, who spent his life trying to figure out why did the democracies in interworld Europe fell apart, so many of them. And Linz came up with the litmus test. Three things. If there were political leaders who didn't take a clear stand against violence, if there were political leaders who said, it's not sure that I will respect the outcome of the election, and if there were political leaders who didn't respect the civil liberties of their opponents, Trump, both before and after the elections, click, click, click. So I'm a little worried when we are saying, yeah, there is some little problem, it's not expanding. If a country like the United States goes this way, which has been for many a beacon of hope for democracy in the world, I think there is a qualitative dimension to this that we have to take into account.
Should I respond? Yeah. Sure. I'll say two things. First is the racial thing. Yes, but under what circumstances can you mobilize along racial lines? You can't disregard the economy and this problem with expectations that are not met on the material side when thinking about that problem. The other is, so what will happen? That's basically what you're saying, and you're a pessimist. I'm an optimist. Why am I an optimist? Is that sort of scientifically based somehow? Now, I think we can say by some certainty that we're social scientists, we suck at predicting the future. When it comes to forecasting, we're just bad. And it's not just us. Economists are really bad at forecasting growth. There have been a lot of psychological studies of this, about the fact that experts cannot predict the future. Philip Tetlock has done a lot of studies of this. So what's the conclusion to draw from that? We're bad at knowing what is going to happen. Well, that means that it's up to us. It's a moral choice whether we want to be an optimist or a pessimist. And I think that the correct moral choice is to be an optimist, because optimism is the only thing that can bring you to take some kind of action. Pessimists, they just sit there and wait for the bad things to happen.
This is the pessimist panel.
Yeah.
Sorry. He brought out the optimist in me. I'll take that hat on again, sorry.
Do you want to say something on that?
No, I mean, I do agree on the count the people, not just countries. I think that's a very valid point, and we have to also see where it happens, of course. It matters if it's in a very fragile country or if we see it in an established democracy. I think that certainly we cannot just look at the units of analysis that are countries. I also think that again, just bringing up, yes, and Donald Trump is a danger, I mean, both because of what he stands for, but also, again, because of the spread, the diffusion of his message, as you say, across the world, and that's certainly helped by, again, social media and just ICT in general, and we don't know yet the impact that had on the election with Russian influence and all those things. So again, that just goes to show that the dangers we see now are magnified in a number of ways.
So whether they are normative trade-offs or threats or other forms of shadows, it seems to be the case that data will help, but it will not go all the way out to foresee or to forecast. But something else seems to be needed, something like thinking, something like conceptual re-engineering, something about putting your mind into it. And that is something that social science and humanities can do very well. So thank you.